Wagner, and I'm going to be going over Introduction to Java today. And uh, and so for the Introduction to Java, basically the learning objectives are to understand the basics of computer operations. So we go over the basics of what computers are and how the basic operations. Learn what a variable is, and then we'll kind of go more into the Java-y stuff with define what define for you what Java operations are, and then understand how to do basic I/O input output in Java, and then combine all elements to make a basic program. So demonstrate making a basic program using different variables, different operators, and basic keyboard and monitor presentation um, I/O. There are basically three parts of a computer: the processor, memory, and input output. So the processor is basically the device that runs all the commands for the computer and does the bulk of the work. The processor is common know companies like Intel and AMD, which make a bulk of the processors, uh, and these run the commands. So when you're writing code, these are basically they write the lines of code. They run the commands in software. The memory is where all the data is stored. So it includes not only includes the data for like you're trying to process with the computer program, but also the instructions are stored in the memory as well. The memory refers to the RAM, the random access memory, not the device you also hear is called memory is the hard drive, which is actually a type of input output or I/O. I/O is basically all the devices that give you information to the computer. So they're basically kind of the periphery that give everything. Like so, this includes keyboards, monitors, stuff like that. So to go a little more depth of the processor is also sometimes called the CPU. And basically, what the processor does is it fetches information from memory, which includes instructions and data, runs it. So basically, every line of code is translated by the programming language into a format that the processor can understand, and then the processor runs those instructions to get it. So generally, this includes fetching data from memory, processing the data, and then writing it back to memory. And the CPU is basically kind of the core of any computer. And then the next part is RAM, or random access memory, which is also sometimes called main memory. And this is where all your application's data instructions are stored. So this is where when you make variables, which we'll talk about later, it puts them in the RAM, which stores the data. And the RAM is usually pretty close to the processor, and it runs very quickly to get data from it. And, and then finally, there's the input output or I/O. The I/O basically just gives data for the CPU and RAM to use. Now this includes hard drives, keyboards, monitors, internet connections, um, video recorders, webcams, basically anything that gives data for the memory and CPU to run. And then I/O devices also have software called drivers, which basically convert the hardware in the from the input output device into a format that the CPU and the computer can process. So to put together the kind of processor and memory is the use of variables. So basically, variables are like names of where, like nicknames of where data is stored. Kind of think about like, for an address, instead of typing out the address, you'd say, oh, this is my house, or this is Bob's house, stuff like that. It's nicknames. And so when you make a variable, you declare it. By declaring it, you define the size or the type of it. So types, for example, of types would be like you want to make it an integer or a floating point number or text. And then the syntax, or basically the way you do variables, is you put type, and so that would be integer, and then the variable name. And so, for example, if I want to make a floating point, so floating point number is a decimal point number, you do float, my float. And then notice how in Java, every line ends with a semicolon. So the semicolon tells the compiler, what runs the program, converts the program into languages that the computer can read, says, okay, I'm done with this line. And the most common mistake I often do is I forget to put semicolons at the end of my things, and it's kind of frustrating. So there's basically a variable type. So variable types tell the computer what type of data is in there, and how much memory to allocate. So there's basically four fundamental types, or three fundamental types that we use. Um, there's a floating point, and there's two types that are usually used for, and these are for decimal numbers. So this would be like prices or salaries or some sort of mathematical values. So there's float, which uses 32 bits. It's also called a single precision number. And there's double, which stands for double precision floating point, which uses 64 bits. And doubles are generally used more often because they have more precise number representation. Basically, the numbers go further out before you have to round. So think of, for example, like representing pi. You can represent more bytes in pi with a double than you would with a float. So integers are basically for whole numbers, numbers without any fractions. And a lot of times integers are usually used for counting or some kind of basic arithmetic. And the last one is string. And it's not a typo here. The other ones are called primitive types, float, double, and int, so they have lowercase letters. The next one's actually called a string class. It's the type that has like extra stuff in there. In a few lectures later, we'll actually go into classes more. The string is basically used for has variable sizes of memory, and it's used for holding text. So think of words for like web pages or for documents and stuff like that. And so there are a few kind of rules and best practices for the names. So when we declare a variable, we have the type and the name. And so you basically kind of, when you declare a variable, give it a meaningful name. For example, if say you're going to hold a sale price. The example here is for a good example would be a sale price. You explain what it means. A bad example would be, in this case, like using the letter A. I see this a lot. I've been teaching for 10 years. And you see a lot of people that kind of, when they first start programming, they kind of just give it meaningless names. But think about when you name a variable that someone else might be reading this, whether it's a teacher or a fellow programmer. And then a variable must start with either a letter, it can be upper or lowercase, or an underscore. And then after the first letter, it has to be numbers or letters. So sometimes you'll see like something like variable 1, variable 2 with the letter spelled variable and the 1 at the end. And then also, as a best practice, use something called camel case, where basically the first letter of the first word, all the words are mashed together, and the first letter of the first word is lowercase, and all the upper letters are uppercase. So in this example, this is my variable. You can see each word is separated with the uppercase letters. And then to manipulate variables, you use something called operators. And operators are basically basic math equations. There's also a few other ones we'll cover in a later class, but we're going to cover two today. We have the basic arithmetic operator, so you have plus, minus, the star is used to multiply since x is a letter, and the compiler, or basically the thing that converts your Java code into machine code, doesn't handle it very well. And then the slash is used for divide. And then also we have the equal sign. So the equal sign means something totally different than it does in normal math. The equal sign means assign the values that you calculate on the right of the equal sign to the variable on the left. So for example, I have my variable, I declared it as integer, so I'm going to add the numbers 4 plus 5, so you get 9, and then it's going to store it into the memory location of my variable in the RAM. And then we talked about, for the variable stuff and operators is basically a way to manipulate the processor and the memory, but we also need to talk about the I/O. So there's special commands, are called methods, that basically access the I/O, the input-output. So for this first example, with the code I'll be doing next, for the keyboard, to get data from the keyboard, you use something called a scanner class. And basically, we'll go into this later, but you need to import data from a basic Java operator that brings in the scanner class so you can use it. And then you run it by declaring and defining the scanner, with the example here, and then reading in values. And again, we'll have an example when I do the code demo next. And then to output to either a Unix or kind of, it's called a console or like a DOS kind of format, use system.out.println, which actually outputs the values. And then, I'll be done. So for the next part of the presentation, we'll basically be putting together everything together that we talked about for this class. So I've opened up Eclipse already. If you need videos how to set up Java and Eclipse, I have them on other videos on my channel. What we're going to do today is start building a project for the introduction for that. We're going to basically put together all the stuff for this project and basically show you also how to make another project, and kind of more complicated than the Hello World I showed in the introduction video. So what we're going to do is click this button and we're going to make a new project. So the project in this case is going to be, I'll make a Java project. So I'm going to click Next, and then give it a name. So the name I'll give this one is, let's call it Intro to Java. And I'm going to be putting files for basically all the different projects in here. You can't see it down on the bottom, but I'll bring this up. You can see the next. And then it's going to build a source file. I'm going to put a bunch of different what's called packages, or basically subfolders within the source file, and we'll be demonstrating those. And if you want to see, and it's going to basically put the output folder. That's basically where, when it creates the actual program, it goes into this bin file. So it's going to create basically two folders, a source and a bin. And then I want to see it in the Java perspective. Now, I personally like, there's two different Java perspectives, but I personally like the Java Enterprise Edition one a little bit better, so I'm going to actually go into that mode. And I'll open up so you can see, where's the console? Oh, the console will come up when I actually end up running it. So I have Introduction to Java, and in here, I'm going to make what's called a package. So I'm going to right click on the source and go to New, and then you have Project, which basically makes a new project. Annotations, a way to make the Java docs. A class is what we'll talk about later, but basically it's a subfolder of code. So basically every file needs to have at least one class, and an enum is for kind of making your own kind of special counter variables. Interface is kind of like kind of a generic template for making other classes. And then we're going to make is a package. So a package is basically a subfolder. So I'm going to call this one Java Basics. And you can't have the same rules for package names as you do with variables. It has to have letters or numbers, and you can't have basically a lot of fancy characters other than the underscore. So I have Java Basics, and then I'm going to make a new class. Now, a class is basically, like I said before, a file that has subcontained code in it. And so I'm going to call this one call it Basic Driver. Now, a driver is basically a way to run the program. Now, classes generally have something called Pascal case, where it's like camel case, except the first letter is uppercase. And this is to differentiate between classes and primitive types like int and stuff like that. And then we want to make a main. So main's where the compiler looks to run the code. So I'll make a main, and then I'm going to also generate some comments. Comments are a way to kind of tell people that are looking at the outside code, either you, after a few years of not looking at it, or months, or outside people, what's going on. So I'm going to make a basic program. Let me clean this up. And so I have this basic class. Now, a package is a kind of, when it makes a folder, it says, okay, everything in this folder is kind of grouped together. So my author is Greg, and then I'll say Snoozle Learning. And I'm going to put all this code on a GitLab site so you can actually see what all this stuff is. And I'll say created. So I forgot there's no doc for create. So created June 23rd, 2017. And then we have our basic parameters going to be arguments. And so what this makes is the class is this kind of is the wrapper for the whole thing. Your file name needs to match this, except it doesn't have, your file name doesn't have .java at the end. It just basically needs to match this. And then you have a main, and then, like I said before, the compiler knows to look for main before you start writing your program. So like I said before, we need to bring in a special type for this read and write program. So what this program is going to do, this program will read in two numbers, add them together, and write them back out. And then this basic program driver. So to read in the values, like I said before, we need to import. So import gets classes from other parts of the program. It's kind of a base class. Java has these kind of ones built in. So I'm going to input that scanner. So this will get the scanner value in. And so the first thing we want to do is declare the scanner variable. So you can see this has Pascal case for the first letter, so saying that this is a class type. So it's another, basically it's open up another folder, scanner. And generally I like to, unless I have multiple names of one, I like to have my type in a what's called a method. This subdivision's a method which runs, and we'll talk about these later, matches the name of this. And then I have a scanner. And then new basically is a way for the program to tell the memory, I'm going to make a new class. So it kind of, the way class are stored in memory is a little bit different than like the primitive types like integer. But we'll show this. So I'm going to do new scanner system dot in. Make sure to put the semicolon at the end. And what this will do is it'll read in from the keyboard. And then what I want to do now, so I'm initializing the scanner class, and then I want to get prompt user to read in value. So I'm going to do system.out, and remember from the previous slide, this prints to the console, which we'll see here in a second. Enter an integer. And then if I do scanner dot next int, it's going to read in a value. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to declare an integer and assign and define it, or assign the value in the same line. So I'm going to call this integer1 equals this. And so what this is going to do is it's going to prompt me to type an integer. I'll type an integer. When I hit enter, it scans the keyboard integer values and puts it into integer1. And then I'm going to prompt it again, so do system.printout. And then you notice here how it's kind of keying me to what words I'm going to do. One thing I like about Eclipse is that it has these prompts to say, okay, if you're typing in, I'm not a great speller, so sometimes it helps me to do it, because spelling, if you have to spell things exactly right, or the compiler is too stupid to figure out what's wrong. So I'm going to type integer scanner 2, do next int. So next int reads in an integer from the command line. If you do next line, that reads in a string. And then I'm going to add the numbers together. So I'm going to make another integer called sum value equals integer 1 plus integer 2. You get the sum value. And then finally, I'm going to print out the whole program, the value. So I'll do print line is, and so if you do the plus symbol after, so I forgot to explain this earlier. Within these quotes, these are what you can put text in your quotes. And the compiler knows, if it sees quotes, that there's gonna be text in there, and it's called a string. And so you can say, if you do a plus symbol plus a value, an integer, generally it will convert that value. So I have some value. It's going to convert that value into an integer, and then, or into a string. Convert that integer into a string, and then concatenate, or basically add to the end of the string value. So what this program is going to do is read in the values and combine them together and print them out. And also, there's some things that the operating system does. So I have scanner. I'm going to close this. So basically it frees up to allow other things to be read in at the same time. It's called basically a blocking function. So let me kind of go over the points of this program again. So again, I have a package which basically says group together everything that's within this folder together. I'm importing in the scanner class, which is used to reading stuff from the keyboard. I have a class which basically kind of wraps around all the code within a particular file. And then I have in here a method, which is kind of a subpart of the class. So you have basically multiple methods within a class, kind of to make it so if you do things multiple times, you want a method. So instead of having to write it out again, you can just call it that method. And then I define a scanner, which reads it from the text, writes it in, reads it, prompts the values, reads it in, closing the scanner, so basically freeing up the keyboard allocation or whatever allocation we're doing. I'm going to add those two numbers together and then print them out. And so in Eclipse, to run the program, I need to click on this, and I'm going to do a new launch configuration. And I can also do another launch configuration. If you right-click on Java, you can do run as let's see, where is it? I'll do Java application. Right click on this, I'll do new, and I have a new configuration. So I'll call this one Java run Java basics. In the main class, so you guys can see it. If I go to search, it should be the only one out there. And then I'll apply it. And I'm going to close this so you can see the Java basics is added up into this list. And then I'm just going to run this. So it's going to save it. It's going to launch it. So it brings up a console. If I want to, I can actually put it down here so you can see the code. I'll run the integer, so I'm going to type in 2, another integer, 3, and this is the sum of the integers is 5. So I hope you enjoyed this video. The next video is going to go over logical statements, so if-then statements, and how do you do Boolean, kind of what Boolean math is. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. I'll be having videos coming out about roughly once a week. And also, follow me on Twitter, which is below, and then also go to this Snoozle Learning website, which I have more information, and then my GitHub website, which has the code that I just generated for you guys.